So I'm a neurosurgeon focused on adult brain tumors, and my research focus is early phase surgical trials. So as you guys talked about, there's different phases. So I'll be happy to tap into that and give some examples. Um, Today, the title of my talk is Democratizing Clinical Trial Access, and the way I'll be approaching that is first give a brief, very brief now, thanks to you guys, overview of clinical trials, then talk about the ethics of clinical trials, because after all, it's a very sensitive topic. It's an individual's health that we're talking about. At the end of the day, even though it's founded in very strong evidence, it is experimental treatment. So we want to make sure it's governed by good ethics. And then I'll give an example of how clinical trials have helped establish the current standard of care for glioblastomas, which is a deadly brain tumor, and then talk about some of the uh, good aspects of it, how the impact it has had, but also some of the challenges associated with that. And then I'll conclude by not just talking about the challenges that someone like myself as the investigator or sponsors face, but also imagining what some of the patients may face in terms of understanding their diagnosis, understanding the process of clinical trials, and enrolling in one. And I think webinars such as this one are hopefully helpful in dispelling some of the myth and helping people afflicted by these terrible diagnoses go through the process and find the right treatment. So the NIH, which is basically the US governing body for healthcare research and clinical practices and guidelines, defines a clinical trial in when there's human subjects involved and an intervention of some sort. Does not have to be just a drug. It can be a behavioral outcome, a simple thing as a brochure, evaluating the impact of that intervention on an individual's outcome. And that can be a behavioral change or a medical outcome. But the key thing is that it has to be prospective. And as Arva mentioned, it means we have time point zero, we have a set of eligible participants, we give an intervention, and we look ahead in time to see how that intervention had an impact. Put in a different way, clinical trials are the primary way in which researchers and clinicians such as myself determine if a new treatment or a prevention strategy or a different way of delivering the treatment can be helpful and whether it's safe for people. So how are clinical trials different from just regular research? There's so many different ways of doing research. You can hand out surveys, you can look at conduct chart review, which basically looks back in time to see how people with a given condition did when a particular drug was given. But clinical trials stand apart because they're prospective, as we talked about, and there's stringent criteria. And these are the eligibility criteria that were mentioned, inclusion, exclusion criteria. And the reason for this is because when you have a novel treatment, you really want to be able to remove external noise from them influencing the outcome that you see. So let's say, for example, you want to see if a new drug is effective in reducing blood sugar in people with diabetes. But we also know that steroids can increase the blood sugar levels. So when we want to test this drug, we want to make sure we exclude patients who are also on steroids. So similar with cancer, and as you guys mentioned, when we want to test a novel therapy for glioblastoma, let's say, people have gone through many different treatments, and the treatments may have delayed effects. So we want to make sure we have a very uniform cohort of patients that we test these interventions on. Statistical considerations. It's not enough to just show drug A improves survival by 10% or a couple of months compared to the current standard of care. It has to be statistically significant too, so that you're sure this difference that you saw is not just by chance. And to do that, you need to look at the evidence from before to see what impact, what effect you expect to see, and make sure that the sample size that you decide for your study is adequately powered. So let's say I'm testing my new drug versus the current standard of care, and I enroll 100 patients, and I don't see a difference. I think, as we can all imagine, this is a disservice to patients because we did not see a difference potentially because we simply did not have enough patients. So it's important to make sure a biostatistician is involved from the very get-go, because otherwise it's a true disservice to patients, a waste of everybody's time, and most importantly, adverse effects on people's health. And then there's a lot of regulatory aspects that go into clinical trials. So as it was mentioned, that there's a lot of myths about the experimental nature of trials, that, you know, if I sign on, I'm stuck for life into the clinical trial. And that's simply not the case, because there's numerous regulatory bodies along the different steps that control to make sure that we have respect for persons, respect for autonomy. Um, One note is, you have observational studies versus interventional studies. Interventional studies, both can be prospective, but interventional ones, there is some form of an intervention, a drug, a surgery, radiation, educational pamphlet, whereas observational studies are the lung cancer and smoking example that Arvo gave. There's different phases of clinical trials. As was mentioned, there's also a phase zero, and they all have their own purposes. And they don't necessarily follow a linear path. When, let's say, you have a very promising phase one result and the cancer is very rare, it's very deadly, you can skip on to a phase three. But as was mentioned, phase zero is to see if the candidate drug, let's say, can replicate the biological effect you expect it to do. So one example is currently I have a trial that's ongoing. It's based on repurposed ketoconazole and posaconazole. These are drugs that are FDA approved for fighting fungal infections in the body. But in the lab from my training in Dr. Zade's lab, it was shown that these can actually help kill tumor cells in a tissue culture in a dish and also kill tumor cells in mice. So that's very exciting. It's promising. These are repurposed drugs so that it can cut into the drug development time. They're off patent, so they're very cheap. But before we launch into a large phase three trial looking at hundreds of patients to see if ketoconazole can extend life of glioblastoma patients, it's important to note that does this drug even get into the brain? Does it penetrate into the brain tumor cells? And does it do what we saw in mice and tissue culture? Because unfortunately, we've cured glioblastoma in mice 50 years ago, but we're not able to replicate that in humans. So a phase zero trial, which is about 5 to 10 patients, is a very quick way of knowing, okay, is this drug getting into the tumor cells in the brain and is it doing what we expect it to do? Otherwise, if it's not, we can stop investigating these azoles. Phase one trials look at the maximum tolerated dose. So in the trial that I mentioned, we're using the lowest safe dose that we currently know for fungal infection. But if there's promise, we move on to a phase one and we stepwise increase the dose until we're worried about a safety signal. And that's the maximum tolerated dose that we would use for the next step, which is a phase two. Phase two, you start enrolling patients with the disease of interest. You're not necessarily comparing them to another treatment. You just want to know if your current treatment extends survival compared to historical outcomes of what you know to be true. And if that's promising, so now you have safety data, you have good biological rationale, and you have some hope for effectiveness. So you're ready to move on to a phase three trial, which compares this new drug on top of standard of care. So as was mentioned, if you're randomized, and phase three trials are usually randomized. So if you're randomized to a control arm, it does not mean that you will not get treatment. It means that you're going to get the current standard of care plus the new treatment. And so in this case, obviously, it has to be well powered, as I mentioned, to make sure you actually see a difference. Now, phase four, it's not really a trial per se. It's basically when you've had at least one, hopefully couple of good phase three trials that have shown good data, the FDA or Health Canada or the European Medical Agency reviews that data and approves the drug for use. And once that drug has been released for public use into the market, the companies perform phase four post-marketing surveillance analysis. And this gives them the opportunity to see whether there's any safety data that they hadn't seen in the well-controlled setting of a clinical trial, or, it's less controlled. So it's a good opportunity to see drug-drug interactions or other side effects that were not seen in these well-regulated clinical trials. So we've already talked about the ethics of clinical trials, and this is very important to note. So today, in 2023, there's lots of codes, regulations, and governing bodies that make sure that clinical trials are ethical. But just as recently as 8 decades ago, this was not the case, and this was really brought to attention as part of the Nuremberg trials, where they investigated the work of some of the German Nazi scientists doing research on vulnerable subjects. And so these trials led to the Nuremberg Code, which basically emphasized the importance of informed consent and protecting patients from unnecessary harm. There's 10 components to this code. We will not go through that, but informed consent is a critical thing. So no one can be enrolled onto a trial unless they've consented to it, and this has to be informed. So that what does that mean? It means they have to have accurate knowledge of what the actual intervention is going to be, what are the known side effects from it, what are the alternatives, and the other steps, whether I can withdraw, what are my rights. So these are all put into an informed consent document that and that any participant must sign before they enroll in a trial. Now, we'll get to this towards the end where we talk about democratizing clinical trials. So it's great to have this informed consent process, but what happens is that you already have a diagnosis that's challenging. You're already going through a pretty difficult treatment schedule when it comes to some of these cancers. And these informed consents, because they're trying to really outline all the details of the clinical trial process and they're trying to meet these laws and regulations, they end up being very long documents and they can be overbearing for patients to understand. Now, the Research Ethic Board ensures that the language is as simple as possible, but it can still be very daunting. So it's getting there, but it's not perfect. Other aspects of the ethics, we have the Nuremberg Code, we have the Declaration of Helsinki, which is specific to medical research. And we also have the Belmont Report, which was published by the US Congress in the 70s. And it's basically emphasizes beneficence. Basically, if I'm an investigator and I've launched a trial, I have the best interest of my patients in mind. And it's respect for subjects, so basically autonomy, making sure people sign informed consent, and also justice, so protecting patients against people who are not following these guidelines. So as you can see, launching a clinical trial is very complex. It's not just a random process. So right now, if I outline the process that I go through as an investigator, I write a protocol because there's very good, promising basic science data. I think we can do good work in humans. Then I submit it to our cancer protocol review committee, and they look at it to see if it scientifically makes sense and whether our institution needs this sort of a trial, whether there's a gap in our institution for this sort of a trial. If we already have 10 other glioblastoma trials, there's no need for me to open another one. Then once they approve that, then it moves on to the Research Ethics Board, which in the US is called IRB. And once they approve that, then I can go on to select other investigators. So my trial is a single center. So I select my colleagues who are clinically sound and also have the research training to make sure that they are able to conduct the research ethically on my behalf or together with me. But if it's a multi-center trial, then I have to go on to different sites and different investigators to make sure their site has all the standard operating procedures and their investigators are well trained. Then we approve the site to participate, we approve the investigators, then it's time to recruit patients and make sure that they can follow through with all the steps. So that's another step in the process that's quite challenging. Then once the study has been completed, or sometimes during the study, the data is entered and analyzed, and we go through the statistical analyses, and we present them at conferences, and we publish our findings in peer-reviewed journals. And the idea, in addition to disseminating the knowledge, is to also get the feedback from our peers. What if we're missing something? What if we're misinterpreting something? So it's important to present the data at conferences to make sure that the final conclusions that are presented to the public and regulatory bodies make scientific sense. So as part of the protection of human subjects, as part of ensuring that clinical trials are transparent, and as you guys mentioned, they're government-funded registries. So in the US, it's called ClinicalTrials.gov. In Canada, it's Health Canada. That anybody, before they enroll any subject onto a clinical trial, has to register their study on ClinicalTrials.gov. And the idea here is that it's multiple fold. One is that it's kind of like a timestamp. At this point in time, this is what the protocol looked like so that we don't randomly keep changing the methods of it based on the results that we see from each individual patient that's enrolled. It increases that transparency. And nowadays, high impact journals will not publish a clinical trial unless it has been published ahead of time, registered ahead of time on a public database like this. The other value of this is that other scientists and patients can search for particular trials. So patients looking with a condition can see if there's any actively recruiting trials in Toronto, let's say, And as a scientist or a clinician, if I think I have a great idea with drug A and I want to run a trial, first thing I would do is go on to ClinicalTrials.gov to make sure there isn't already other studies out there. Otherwise, what's the point if my study is not better than that? And there's also a push that whatever study is registered on this database gets published when it's completed, whether negative or positive. Unfortunately, a high percentage of clinical trials are negative, but we want to still publish that because it's helping the future generation of scientists and clinicians to know, okay, this treatment did not work, or it didn't work for this reason and that reason. So perhaps I can improve upon it. So it's the purpose of it is very valid. You know, it has a lot of value for patients, investigators, governing bodies, etc. But it can be challenging, and I'll get to that at the end. Let's switch gears to a case example of how clinical trials have impacted brain tumor research. So, glioblastoma is a devastating disease. It's unfortunately it's the most common primary adult brain tumor. And despite our best efforts right now, the average survival is 14 to 18 months. And what's challenging about these is that you won't know you have a glioblastoma until you have a symptom. Otherwise, you're going about your day-to-day life like any other normal person. So it's hard to have the awareness about what glioblastoma is and what the options are until you have these symptoms. And they can be very broad because it depends on which part of your brain it affects. So it can be seizure, cognitive issues, slow to process information, motor sensory deficits, memory, language, and vision issues. So the Stroop trial, right now our standard of care is called the Stroop protocol, STUPP, and it's based on a landmark trial that was performed all the way back in 2005. Before that, anybody who had a glioblastoma had surgery and radiation. Um, and survival was on average 8, 9 months. What Stoop did is there was some promising data that an oral pill that you take by mouth called temozolomide can help glioblastoma patients. But we wouldn't know that unless we randomize patients in a large sample to see whether on top of surgery and radiation, does temozolomide help survival. So I'm glad we've had the terminology down. This was a double-blind, randomized, placebo-controlled study, meaning that the investigators and the patients did not know whether they're getting temozolomide or sugar pill, placebo. They were randomized, basically a coin toss. And look at this. It enrolled 573 patients across 85 centers. So if you do the math, that's about 7 patients per site. And the key findings were that the combination significantly improved survival rates. So it was 14 months versus 9, 10 months. And so this is great. This has established a new standard of care. The downside is that we have not been able to move the needle at all over the past 20 years, and it's not for a lack of effort. Numerous different clinical trials have been attempted, but none of them have had the tremendous impact that the Stu protocol had. So some of the challenges faced, and they were successful in recruiting the large sample size that they needed, but many trials do close because they're simply not able to recruit the number that they need in a timely fashion. You know, you can't have a trial going on for 10 years because it's just not serving patients right. You need to trial to finish in a reasonable amount of time so that that data can be meaningful. And to do this well across the 83 centers, and to meet all these regulatory check boxes and to make sure that the research is conducted in a fair, ethical, and clean way, it's a high cost associated with it. But when done well, it can have a lasting influence, paving the way for standard of care and setting benchmarks for the next treatment. So right now, any new drug that comes onto the show, it has to be compared to the baseline of the STU protocol, temozolomide, radiation, and surgery. So challenges, let's put it from both perspectives. For me as an investigator, these are rare tumors, so you don't encounter them that often. And what's even more challenging is that even though it's called glioblastoma, there's so many different genetic subtypes of it. And I may see a lot of glioblastomas, but compared to lung cancer and brain cancer, it's not as common. So pharmaceutical industry is not as keen on putting in the resources to find cures for brain tumors. So as a result, there's much less funding when it comes to brain tumor trials from pharma. So a lot of brain tumor trials are actually from foundation and government funding rather than pharma funding. And the brain is complex, as you can imagine. It's the essence of who we are, and also it's evolved over millions of years of evolution to protect us. We have a blood-brain barrier to protect our brain from the toxins that float in the body. And these toxins can also be the chemo drugs that we develop. So sometimes the novel treatments may need to be delivered directly into the brain. And sometimes, ideally, you would want to keep sampling that tumor to see what's happening. You can do that with a liver tumor or a lung tumor, but you can't do that with a brain tumor. So some of the design aspects and the challenges that go into it make brain tumor clinical trial design much more challenging. And then you have participation barriers. So you have the standard things such as social situation, language barrier, but on top of that, you have patients who at the end of the day have a tumor affecting their brain. So it's hard to keep up with some of the information that's being thrown at you, to comprehend it. You may not be able to read it. You may not be able to convey your thoughts. So these are all aspects that go into making it challenging for patients. And on that note, number one, like you just have been told you have a glioblastoma, how do you go about understanding it? You can try to look up on Google and go on the databases that someone like myself publishes articles on, but it's challenging to understand scientific literature. And it's hard to find the right person with the right information to explain this to you. Let's say you've understood your diagnosis and you understand that clinical trials are an option. How do you go about finding the right trial? So you're kind of dependent on the medical team that you're dealt. So when you have these symptoms, you go to the nearest hospital and you're in a way at the mercy of your clinical team having a clinical trial available or at least introducing you to a clinical trial. Otherwise, how would you know? You can go on ClinicalTrials.gov and Brandon, you outlined nicely how one can filter from the 3,700 clinical trials to find the 5 that are in your city. But you also showed that in Canada, for example, there's numerous sites running trials, and oftentimes all of them do run the same multi-center trials. So let's say you're in North Bay, Ontario, and you're deciding whether you should go to Toronto or Ottawa. How do you know which one to pick? Is there any transportation issues, logistic issues, costs associated with it? And also, once you determine that, what about all the medical jargon? So clinicaltrials.gov has a lot of medical information that even someone like myself, who should be well versed with this, has a hard time understanding. So these are all challenges that patients face, and it doesn't make it easy. Having said that, data shows that participation, going back to the myth, sorry, participation in clinical trials, even if you're on the placebo arm, can lead to better outcomes because we're trying to meet these regulatory hurdles and make sure the drug is safe. So we do a lot more monitoring, a lot more blood tests. So people are more closely monitored, and potential tumor recurrence or side effects are detected much earlier. So that's great, but some of the other challenges still remain when it comes to clinical trials. So look at this. So this is another way of looking at clinicaltrials.gov. They're making efforts to make it better and more user-friendly. But at the end of the day, look, you can look at the title, phase 2 trial of alemtuzumab and for this disease, and these are the drugs. So it's hard for patients to really be able to sit down and go through all this and understand what it's all about. So this is where I think initiatives such as WeTrials can be helpful. WeTrials' 3 pillars are simplification, education, and support. So the idea here is to have simplified information about the diagnosis and about relevant clinical trials delivered in bite-sized pieces of information. So one does not need to know all the information that's out there available about glioblastomas. Let's say I need to know what are my options? What is my tumor when I'm first diagnosed? Then, when I've gone through the standard of care, what's next? Okay, clinical trials are my next option. All right, let's look at clinical trials. There's 10 of them. I don't understand them. Can we simplify the language of what I need to do, how many times I need to go, what do I need to bring to the table? And that's part of education as well. And then the support, we talked about needing a network of individuals who can help you make the decision, better understand your disease, but also going back to the example of having to pick between Ottawa and Toronto, let's say one of them offers free transportation or a free hotel stay during the time that you're participating in a clinical trial. That information may not be readily available. I myself, as an investigator, don't necessarily know that sometimes what my hospital offers. So by curating that information from the specific trial or the specific institution and demonstrating that to the patient, that at least may help in the decision-making process. So this comes in an app format and it's also a web format. It's up and coming. The proof of concept is being established with glioblastomas, but the goal is to expand it to all brain tumors and then all cancers. We have our plans in mind of what the challenges are and how we should go about them. But at the end of the day, the only individuals that can inform how such a platform can be shaped ideally are the patients and care partners and the individuals who have actually gone through it. So it would be great if you have any ideas or want to contribute or want to participate to reach out to us. We have our socials here. We have our email. We would love to learn from you and be partners in this journey to make clinical trials simpler. Thank you for your time and attention.